in January. So thanks to our lockdown last year, it got written. So it is a bit of a tome, but there's about one paragraph from the original book in here. The rest is all brand new. And the play activities, there's 114 pages of play activities. And these have been totally redone. Down the bottom, it tells you the developmental age and the skill, and then the play goal. And I've also got functional goals, because we know the webinar this morning is about when you build pretend play, there's a whole lot of language and social skills and a whole lot of other things that you see occur in children. So as Eileen said, I do have a lot of slides. You do have them all in your handout. I do want to spend 45 minutes going through the case studies in detail, highlighting the red flags, as well as looking at how you understand that child's play. So I will be going through the key slides, but you've got more information because you have the PowerPoint handout. Okay, so sorry, it's nighttime here. So I'll just need to drink and keep my voice alive. Okay, I'm going to share my screen and let's start. And I'm assuming, Eileen, you'll check the chat.
Yeah, I keep an eye on everything. Don't worry about anything. I'm going to throw a couple of people in as being co-hosts, just in case they spot anyone in the waiting list in room that I miss, or if anybody is. And I'm also, sorry, last thing, I'm going to put my phone number into the chat box, because if anybody has poor Wi-Fi and gets cut out at any stage, if you need to send me a message, if I don't spot you in the waiting room, you'll have my phone number to send me a text. So,
okay, and my internet should be fine, because not many people should be on internet at this time, but I only go out for about 20 seconds if I do, but it should be fine. So this is a website where the assessment I'm talking about today and the book is available in the shop, but there's also a lot of free resources on this, including a nice little picture book for children when all the toys got sick, because my little 2-year-old neighbour in the middle of lockdown couldn't come here and play anymore, and she couldn't play with her friends or go to the playground, and she really started, I could tell she was feeling like she was bad and something was wrong. So there's a nice little book there. That's free, just a free download. I don't know if that's helpful, but anyway, let you know it's there. So we know there's lots of types of play. There's gross motor, large muscle movement, fine motor for, our fingers threading, doing fine things with our hands. Then there's visual perceptual play, where we have shape, size, colour. Children are doing puzzles and they're putting different shapes together. Auditory play, where it's rhythm and movement, and sensory motor play, where you're feeling textures, playing in the sand, playing in water. And then pretend play. And I think pretend play is very powerful, because you can impose pretend play on any of these other types of play. So the gross motor play, for example, this could be a bridge in a jungle and you've got to go through the cave, and you impose this other meaning on what's happening in the play. You go beyond the literal. And so there are key skills in pretend play. There's a substitution of one object for another. So if you take a pen, take a pen, and that's a person, so that's an object substitution using a symbol in play. You attribute a property. So my pen is really happy. I've got a very, very happy person, and my person is so happy they're going to eat this cake, which is an absent object. So my person eating the cake, who's very, very happy, is a very different level of play to a child that's just manipulating a pen in the air with no other imposed meaning. So it does take play to a whole other level. And as you know, in non-directive play therapy and a lot of the play therapies, children play in the metaphor, and they can't play in the metaphor if they don't have pretend play skills. So children can do that too, with like a truck trailer can be a boat, or a truck is broken, or the doll goes to sleep, or the doll is naughty, or a wave in the air is a doorway. So pretend play is about the imposition of meaning on objects, toys, and actions. So here we have diagram. So the bottom is on the left-hand side. You have the child's environment, their social, cultural, physical environment, and then they develop their sensory motor skills and then pretend play. If we pull that apart, this golden triangle at the bottom is a child's birth, and the motor and sensory play is really predominant in those first couple of years of life, because the child is learning to move their body against gravity, they're learning what their body does, they're learning about their environment. Pretend play kicks in the second year of life, and it is the predominant form of play, certainly by 4, 5 and as children enter school. So if we ignore pretend play, you can see we ignore a lot about a child's ability. And the motor skills underpin, like they come in under pretend play, because a child's body, you integrate your body. Ebel talks about poise. So the whole body integrates to be able to engage so the child can engage in play. So we're going to really think about pretend play and melting pot of ability, because knowing what pretend play is related to helps us identify what the red flags are when a child has really poor play. So pretend play is related to social competence, and we'll look at a couple of slides on that. It's related to metacognition, so thinking about what you're thinking about as you're playing. It's related to language, problem solving, emotional understanding, because children play out events in their life, creativity, narrative is very strongly related to narrative, and story, which has something to do with understanding context, also self-regulation and divergent thinking. Now, some colleagues and I have expanded on this. This is not in your handout because it's not totally my IP, but we have looked at, you have this personal social competence with non-verbal communication and embodiment. So a child picks up intuitively what is happening within the play or what is happening socially. It's also that metacognition, and we also have metacommunication with language. So we have metacommunication is talking to your peers about play and what you want to play, like what shop is it going to be, who's going to be the shopkeeper, what are we going to sell, and then you change your voice and your language for when you are the shopkeeper. So this metacommunication is very fluid within pretend play. And there's problem solving, narrative, the social use of language, creativity and creative and critical thinking, divergent thinking and understanding context. And then this whole area of emotional understanding. There's more and more literature coming out now on self-awareness, self-regulation, that autobiographical narrative, that playing out what I do in my life. You know, I have a cup of tea, I go to the playground, I pretend to have a cup of tea, go to the playground, go to sleep. So that's autobiographical narrative, building the story of me. And then pleasure, surprise, anticipation, flexibility, poise and understanding. This is Scott Ebel's work, who has a paper on the elements of play in the American Journal of Play. So that emotional engagement is really important. So let's have a quick look around learning, just the first point on this slide. So preschool children with difficulty in sequencing their play actions. So a sequence of play actions is you put the blocks in a truck, you push the truck and you take the blocks out. That's a logical sequence. And object substitution. If children had difficulty in those two areas, they were identified as children whose teachers and parents had concerns over their pre-academic ability. And this was early research developing the child-initiated pretend play assessment, and it had a sensitivity of 0.82. So that meant just looking at a child's pretend play ability, 8 out of 10 children could be accurately identified as being at risk for learning at school. So pretend play and literate behaviour and learning are argued to share the use of decontextualised language to convey meaning. Children talk a lot more in their play, and I am going to spend a bit of time on a Kidd and Quinn paper that came out just in 2019. It's also narrative competence, because children's play is narrative to the extent that fictionalised characters encounter events in pretend settings, and you need to have organisation of thinking. So pretend play and language, we now know that pretend play is an important precursor to language. And in the second year of life, pretend play development coincides with two-word utterances. So they're very, very linked. McCoon in 95 did a lovely study with toddlers, and she found that pretend play and expressive language were significantly related. Children who engage in pretend play use more language, and reading ability has been found to be predicted by a child's ability to meta play. So you talk about the play as you play. And there are significant and concurrent and longitudinal associations between symbolic play, which is pretend play, and language across the years 1 to 6. That was a really big meta-analysis that came out in 2018 with 35 studies covering over 6,500 children. But narrative is where pretend play is really important. And it develops before narrative because narrative is expressive language. So at 2 years, children tell a story about themselves, and at 2, children are playing out stories in and out of the home. From 2 to 3 years, children attempt fictional storytelling, and by 3 in their pretend play, children are acting out characters from movies that they like or stories. At 3, children begin to develop narrative ability, and certainly at 3, they are developing quite complex pretend play skills. From 3 to 5 years, children move from describing objects and they start doing temporal sequencing. So it's nighttime, it's morning, and they have actions relevant to solving a problem. And certainly at 4, children put lots of problem in their play when they're playing. Preschoolers can tell stories, and their storytelling can be enhanced. And by school age, the majority of children possess a repertoire of narrative abilities. Now, they don't know that, but they know they can play with 2 or 3 friends with an idea about a story over 2 or 3 weeks, and they can have dolls and teddies and trucks and things in that story. They have problems, they have things to solve. By 3rd grade, children tell complete stories, and by 11 and 12, they reach their peak in the ability to tell oral narratives. Most children have mastered story grammar, and children extend beyond storytelling and narrative. And it's this age that children's play changes. So often children are packing up all their toys about this age because they're ready to advance into adolescence. So all these skills they've developed in pretend play are now flipped and in their head, and they're ready to go and interact with peers, and their social interactions become a lot more complex. So we know that narrative understanding is thinking about what might happen next. And we know children on the spectrum have difficulty with pretend play, and they have difficulty with narrative. So they are often anxious because they don't know the context of what's happening, and they don't know what might happen next. And so you also do lots of divergent problem solving in narrative. So in pretend play, children engage in creating stories. For most of the time they're playing. They can be very simple, like having a drink with Teddy, or they can be quite complex, creating a fantasy land with characters, dragons, and other creatures, for example. So in terms of brain development, we know the hippocampus is not mature till 3, which is our narrative memory, but in our amygdala, our emotional memory, it's mature in utero. So, and it's at 3 that children's play really does get a lot longer. Children spend a lot more time creating stories in play, and they have fictional stories as well as everyday stories in their play. So as we know, Siegel and Bryson talk about narrative integrating both sides of the brain. So integrates the feelings with the words. And as you know, the left brain is very ordered and literal and logical, and our right brain is that intuitive part. It processes emotions and autobiographical narratives. It gives us that gut feeling. It interprets emotional information, and it's autobiographical. Kesley, you may have got Kesley, is it the interpersonal neurobiology of play? And she talks more about this integration between the right and the left hemispheres. So stories come into the right, they go to the left to be put into language, and then they come back to the right again to be processed to a higher level in terms of metaphor. So we have the right is grounded in our non-verbal storytelling. It makes sense of the whole. It processes gesture, sounds and feeling. It goes to the left hemisphere where we experience that through language, and it represents that information in language back to the right hemisphere, and the right hemisphere then processes that autobiographical and metaphorical information, which gives us an embodied and a coherent story. So we know stories that mean a lot to us is because they have we have an emotional connection to it. So this back and forth, as I said, gives us meaning of the story in our bodies while hearing the story told in our words. Louise Jelly was a speech therapist who did her master's, and she found that children who imitate in play, who couldn't think about what to play, who had to watch someone else before they could play, they were also children that had really poor narrative, both spontaneous and retell. And we did some work in a school where we had some children, 57 children overall. Half of them were in this lovely school that had a play-based curriculum, and the other half were in a school that had a very traditional curriculum. And we went in on time one at the beginning of the school year, and then we went in near the end of the school year, and we found that the children in the traditional curriculum didn't change much in their narrative understanding, but the children in the play-based curriculum, this green line here, they really were significantly shifted in their narrative understanding. So that in your paper, there's publications from that study. So social competence, as we know, a lot of animal research looked at why young animals do play fighting. And originally it was thought because this is important for learning how to hunt. But further research found that animals who didn't do play fighting could still hunt. But what they found was that if you didn't play fight when you were a young animal, you didn't pick up social cues when you're an adult, and you weren't as successful in attracting mates. So we know that play, so this is Pansep's work where he looked at the play circuit and social joy, was really important. And we know in human children, play and pretend play are connected to social competence. So there's, I'll leave that slide because that's just in there, that information. But theory of mind and pretend play, there's heaps of literature around this, but I just want to talk about Nielsen and Dissananke. They did find reliable associations between that false belief performance, you know, when you understand that someone else hasn't got the full picture. So for example, 4-year-olds came in and they were showing a picture of lollies, a box of lollies, and asked what was in there. And they thought lollies was in there, but when the box was opened, it was pencils. So when the next child came in, they said, what will they say is in it? And the children who knew there were pencils in there would say no, they would think there's lollies because they don't know. So they found there were very reliable associations between false belief and pretense of object substitution in play and the assignment of a role in play. So certainly as children learn to play, they do become a lot more socially aware. And there's a little bit more on that slide for you, and the same with that one. But I want to talk about intentionality, because Rakowski has got some lovely articles, and he was very interested in do children really understand what they're doing when they're engaging in pretend play. And he found that 3-year-olds, early 3-year-olds had intentionality in their play. They really understood it. And I was reading papers that were sort of debating whether children really understood it or whether they were just copying without any meaning. And I was working in the playroom with 2-year-olds building their pretend play, thinking these children really know they're pretending to have a drink and Teddy's having a drink. And so he found, for example, they do. And for example, he did a study where they had 3-year-olds, and they had one experimenter, and they had blue blocks of soap and green blocks of food. and they were playing, you know, with the puppets, with the green blocks as food and the blue blocks as soap. And then a second experimenter came with a puppet, and that puppet started eating the blue blocks. And all the children went, no, you can't do that. You can't eat the soap. So children understood the meaning in the play, and they understood the symbolic meaning of the blocks. So children create narratives in their play that increase in complexity, and they create these shared joint meanings in their pretend play. And they do that by conversational exchanges, building on the ideas of others. And this research is with 4-year-olds, introducing a new idea, adding in new props, and then showing acceptance or rejection of a peer's idea through verbal and non-verbal communication. So that shared meaning is all that right brain, you know, all that sort of working out what's going on, understanding the meaning, processing in the left and sending it back to the right. So when children engage in pretend play with others, they are socially interacting, they understand the perception, the social meanings of what's happening, and they're creating a story. And all these things are happening simultaneously, which is why pretend play is so powerful, but it's also so important. So this is a beautiful study, Quinn and Kidd in 2019, and I'm going to explain this one to you. And I also was an examiner for Creage's PhD thesis, and they have Quinn, Kidd and Creage have just got, if you put their names in Google Scholar, you should be able to get a pre-publication publication combining these two studies. So I'm going to explain what they did. So there were 54 caregivers, mother or parent and child. The first study with Quinn and Kidd was of the children when they were 18 months old, and then they came back 6 months later when the children were 24 months old. And what they did was very clever. So they had 10 minutes. They gave these toys on the left, so the magnetic board, the puzzle, the hammer and peg set. They gave these toys for 10 minutes for the parents to play with their child. And they had 10 minutes then, they'd take those toys away, and then they had 10 minutes in what they call symbolic play, but I call this pretend play, but it's the same concept. So this is, as you see, a tea set, you know, got a piece of felt, couple of blocks, a teddy, spoons and a phone, and they swapped the order of these over across all the dyads so that, you know, there was no bias, and they didn't give the parents any instructions. They just said, here's some toys to play with your child. Okay, so what did they find? They found there was a lot more joint attention and longer joint attention during symbolic play or pretend play, significantly. They also found there was what they call more in-hand iconic gestures. So, you know, the parent would be stirring the cup or giving the cup to Teddy in the symbolic play more than the functional play. And they concluded the paper by saying symbolic play or pretend play requires in the moment meaning making, because it fosters those really important social cognitive skills of joint attention, shared action, imitation, and this is very important for building a child's communication development. Now, 6 months later, when the infants were 24 months, they came back, did exactly the same thing, made lots of videos, and now the children are 6 months older, and they found that the children's language was a lot more complex and they spoke more often during the pretend play. Parents and carers engaged their child in more conversation. Parents used more questions, and they, you know, talked about the meanings in things. There was a lot more turn taking. There was a lot more conversation, and infants carried a greater conversational load. Also, there was a longer gap between the parent saying something and the infant responding, because the language was more complex and the child had to think a little bit more deeply about it. And this is an example of some of the data. So this is in, you know, less than minute seconds analysis of the videos of the parents. On the left here, you'll see this is a number of conversational interactions and language that occurred during pretend play with both the parent and the child. And on the right, this is the amount of language and talking that occurred during that functional play, you know, with the magnetic board and the puzzle. So there, you can see there's just a significant difference in the amount of that communication that's occurring in pretend play. They also found in functional play that parents took control and were a lot more directive and instructional. So the child didn't need to talk so much. And in functional play, parents took over the conversational load. There was less joint engagement compared to the symbolic play. So they argued very strongly that it's pretend play or symbolic play itself that is a complex communicative context, because you have to negotiate meaning. You've got to work out, you know, what the felt is, what the blocks are. Are you cooking something? Are you feeding? What's Teddy drinking? There's a lot more negotiation of meaning that occurs. That's a little bit more on object substitution. It is a really key factor in play, and there's just some references there for other studies that I've done where it's come out as incredibly significant and important. So self-regulation, there's more work coming out here. Elias and Burke did a study and found that preschool children who were more competent in pretend play showed a lot more of that emotional self-regulation. And Sunderland and also Pansett argue very strongly that a child needs to play in order to self-regulate. And so does Siegel, and so does Stuart Brown. Now, I just wanted to add this in. It's about that inner speech and private speech, because Vygotsky thought this was a very important link between self-regulation and symbolic thinking. So at 2 years, a child refers to absent objects and asks parents to find a toy. So that's you know, they know something's missing, so they go and ask. At 3, they talk to themselves like, where's my teddy? And at 8, they have silent speech. You really can't hear, they're thinking in their heads. And again, Burke, Mann and Ogan found that there were high levels of self-speech in 2 to 6-year-olds who were engaged in pretend play because they were self-regulating. They were talking to themselves and self-regulating. So I'll leave that for you to read. This is more about creating that shared meaning and how complex it is for children. Creativity and problem solving. Sandra Russ has done a lot of work, a lot of research on pretend play and creative thinking, because engaging in pretend play facilitates a child's creative problem solving. That's divergent, so lots of solutions to a problem, as well as insight, ability, and she's also looked at flexibility in problem solving and thinking of alternative coping strategies. And longitudinally, she found, this is 4 years later, that the quality of a child's pretend play, and she used her effect in play scale, predicted divergent thinking, that's being flexible in thinking what a problem was, and over time, which was independent of a child's IQ. So I did look at this in my PhD, but I've never published it, still sitting there. So I had 80 children. I had 40 children who were typically developing and 40 children who had no diagnosis, but teachers were concerned about them coping at school. These were children aged 4 and 5. This is one of the early studies in the chipper, and they were matched. So you'll see there the typically developing children and the children with suspected pre-academic problems. They were very similar in age and gender. So I used a child-initiated pretend play assessment, and I just used the object substitution score on that assessment. I also had the Lieberman's playfulness scale, which parents filled in, and I had a creative thinking test, the associative fluency test, because in the literature, a person called Ward had used it with preschoolers, so I did what he had found. So what I found was, and that's just the data slide giving you the numbers, but what it meant was there was a significant, moderate positive relationship between object substitution and pretend play, of course, but object substitution and creative thought, which is often called divergent problem solving. And people talk about, you know, the ability to suspend reality, or, you know, to just imagine something. And object substitution is related to that, because when you use a shoe as a phone, you have to suspend the reality that it's a shoe and go beyond that and play with it like it's a phone. And also object substitution and playfulness. So children were a lot more flexible in their thinking and creative and a lot more playful if they were able to engage with object substitution. So I just might stop there. We have time for if there's any major questions on that, because now we're going to apply. Everyone okay to keep going? Yeah, okay. See a few nods. So let's have another look at that information, but turn it upside down. So identifying children who show red flags for playability, knowing that pretend play has strong links to all those areas of development. So we have children who have poor language. If you have a child with a language delay, their pretend play is going to be delayed. It really is worth looking at. Children who are unorganised, I know there's lots of reasons for that, but if a child can't organise their actions in their play, if they can't sequence logically their actions in play, build a story, understand context, they're going to be running around the place. They're not going to be sitting down, setting up a scene. They're going to be looking unorganised and not being able to stay in one spot for very long. Children whose story comprehension is below their age level, these are children who have not understood what's happening in the story. And if you look at their play, I can tell you their pretend play there's going to be some issues with their ability to play. Children who have difficulty understanding the meaning of what they're reading. So I've come across children who can read really well because visually they're very clever, but they have no idea what they're reading. They can't answer a question on, you know, what the characters are doing or what's going to happen next, or, you know, what happened in the story. Children who find it difficult to write a story, so they can hold a pen and they can scribble, you know, they can write, but it's thinking about what to write, you know, what to write. And Louise found this, children who couldn't initiate their own play had great difficulty with narrative, spontaneous narrative, as well as looking at pictures and telling a story. They had great difficulty. Children who give minimal answers to questions on a text. So again, you're reading a story about a postman and a dog and a bird, but the child can tell you there's a postman and a bird and a dog, but they can't really tell you what's happening in the story. They just pick up the main words in there. And children who find it difficult to predict what might happen in a story, because narrative thinking is about thinking about what's going to happen next. And we know from 4, children put problems in their play because it's intellectually challenging and they've got to work out how to solve it. And then the story shifts and the story changes and they've got to work out where it's going. Also, it's social. So if you have a child always on the side when peers are playing, you know, they don't know how to join the play, or they're very disruptive to other children's play. Particularly if they're destroying other children's play scenes and they get into trouble and they do it the next day, because you need to look at that child's ability to play themselves. Because children who don't know how to play and have very low playability do not understand what children are doing. So in a sandpit, for example, if children have roads and bridges and, you know, they've got all their trucks going everywhere and delivering things, a child who doesn't understand play will look at that play scene and they'll see flat bits of sand. They might see a hole with a stick across it, like a bridge over a river. They might see piles of things, but they just see flat sand, bits of flat sand, bits of hills in the sand, a hole with a stick over it. So what's the problem? I'll just go in there and pick a truck up. And everyone else gets really mad with them because they've just destroyed their scene or interrupted their play. So because I find when children do that, when you have a look at their play, usually their play is very delayed for their age, you build their ability to play, they stop doing that. They may not understand the play, but they know there's something happening. There's always children whose play always ends in everything crashing or dying. is a play quality. I know you look at children's emotional well-being as well, but it's also worth considering, is this because the child doesn't know how to extend the play? The child doesn't know how to go and add more things to the play. So of course, everything dies, everything crashes, that's the end. So you just play for a short time because you don't know how to extend the play. Children who have no friends to come home and play, as children are known to be rough by pushing other children down. So I have worked with quite a few children who wanted to socially interact with children, but they go and push them over because they had no idea how to engage socially. And of course they had very or no pretend play usually. Children who wander around aimlessly at daycare, preschool or school, or during recess, because they just, or they're standing right beside the teacher. Those children who come and stand beside the teacher because that's safe, that's secure, I don't have to cope with what other people are doing. You also might have children who are very literal and concrete in their comments and thinking. So for example, as I said before, you can use a shoe as a phone, and children who have no object substitution will just go, you're being stupid, you can't use a shoe, that's a shoe. What are you doing with the shoe on your face? So they can't see the meaning in the play. Children who can't follow a conversation. Now, conversation is narrative. So that's you say something, I add something, you add something, I add something, you add something, I add something. We build this conversation, this story between us. So children who can't follow a conversation, either socially or their narrative, they certainly need looking at. And parents comment that their child needs to be entertained all the time. If you have that comment, the child can't initiate play. They can't think about what to play, they can't go and do it, and they need to be entertained all the time. I've had a few parents say that to me, and when I've assessed their child's play, they are like 2 to 4 years delayed. So we know where to start and we know where to go. So that did skip. So we're going to look at 2 case studies, but as a prelude to that, I just want to explain quickly the Pretend Play Enjoyment Developmental Checklist, which we're going to look at. I'll take you through that. It is a manual. There's a manual with a professional scoring booklet and a parent carer booklet. Now, in the first Learn to Play book, there was a little developmental assessment called the Symbolic and Imaginative Play Developmental Checklist. Well, this completely replaces it because I had no idea when I wrote that it would be so useful. And I know in Australia, it's been very useful. So in 2018, I thought it's about time we actually made this a little bit more robust, having had 20 more years clinical experience using it. So we have the Pretend Play Developmental Checklist with the scoring booklet for professionals. So it has in it a summary of all the play skills, a summary of the enjoyment score scale, the scoring symbols and summaries of a child's emerging sense of self, and ages in there. Parent carer booklet has no ages because parents get too depressed when they find out the child's play is so delayed, but there is a description of play across different skills in there, and parents just identify what they've observed. So it is for all children 12 months to 5. It's a criterion referenced assessment with standardised scoring and administration. It looks at pretend play ability across six skills, a child's enjoyment of play, and a child's sense of self-representation. So it gives you a developmental equivalent for play, a rating of enjoyment, and a description of a child's emerging sense of self, which is very new research, I must say. So the play abilities are play scripts. So these are the stories in the play, sequences of play action, object substitution, doll teddy play, role play, and social pretend play. Now, true play is emotionally engaging as well as the ability to play. And I found that children who have very poor playability, they don't have any pleasure or joy in play. It's really a duty or a task. So, they put the teddy in the truck and push it because, you expect them to do that. Or there's no joy. The anticipation is either obsession or shock. Like, you know, they just want more and more of it, and you know, it doesn't, it's not joyful. Surprise is terror or distress, so they get fright, but by the fact the toy squeaks, or you know, the puppet jumps up. And their understanding, often there's a lot of disinterest and indifference. And I've seen a lot of children who don't care, you know, that I'm going to feed the teddy with the cup, because they have no idea what I'm doing and they don't care. So that enjoyment is really critical. And poise, bringing the whole body together. So instead of that, you'll get tossing toys and non-careful placement of play materials. That material should be on the other side there. There's also a description of sense of self based on Susan Harder's work, from 2 to, with also some more information around theory of mind development and some play themes by Erickson. Some of Virginia Ryan's work is in there. So to administer it, you actually supply your own toys. You only really need a teddy, truck, bed, spoon, cup, box and cloth. That will give you a lot of information about a child's play. So if you have a child who's 3 or under, you just need something like that that's appropriate. You might be seeing a 5-year-old and you might suspect that they are really struggling in play. So you might want to put out toys similar to that. And if you find the child can do more than you thought, then you can bring in something like a doctor's kit or a garage or a farm set and see what else they do with that. So administration is, you have some toys out on the floor and you invite the child to play whatever they want, and you sit near but to the side, never in front, because you want to create safety. And I'm sure you learn all about creating safety in the room for a child. And you need to observe. 5 minutes is a long time for a child who's not doing anything. So for, 5 minutes, if they're not interacting with play materials, then you come in and you do one play action. So that might be push the truck, or it could be give Teddy a drink, just one action, and you observe the child's response. They might come and join you and start playing. They might ignore you. If they ignore you, then you try something else, or you might verbally go, "Oh, here comes Teddy," or something like that, to see if they can engage with the toys and what they do. Scoring is based on a symbol system. So you're looking at whether a child can spontaneously self-initiate, or whether the child sees what you do and they come and join you and add to what you do. So both of these show the child has ability. The square is the child imitates with meaning. So they saw what you did, so they come and feed Teddy now, but they do it again and again and they change it a bit. And that is them really understanding what they're doing after they imitate you. Or a child might just watch you and not do anything, but just watch, so focused attention. Or a child might do what you did, but it's pretty gruff, it's very fleeting, and you know they were just doing it to keep you happy. And so they had no meaning, they didn't understand, or no play. There's also an enjoyment scale, which goes from 0 to 6, with 0 being no joy, 1 being a task, 2 being it's a script or learnt event, particularly for children on the spectrum. 3, you just saw a fleeting little glimpse. 4, you saw some joy, a bit more. 5, they really had a nice time. And a 6, they didn't want to go. They just wanted to stay and play. So examples of scoring. I scribble all over my scoring sheet. I don't do this on the spot. I do this later, but I scribble everywhere. So let's say Mary had a score of 5. So she really enjoyed it. She had a lovely time. She had some understanding, others think different things to her. She spontaneously joined in with doll play. She didn't use personal pronouns. She seemed to be lost and bewildered by life, but she loved the social interaction. And maybe she really didn't understand what she was looking at. So the dots are her spontaneous play. And you can see Mary, even though she may be 5 years old, is on this 12 to 19 month level of play. So 1 action, 1 object. And she joined you, but you needed to do something first before she came and played with you. And you did one more thing, and she did join you. This is object substitution. Maybe you use the box as a bed, or a block as a phone, and she did it, but you know, you could tell it had no meaning for her. So, you know, this is something you've got to work on. And then you did a few more things in the play, but she stopped then because it was getting a bit complicated for her. So, you know, this child has joy and really loves playing. But really is struggling with play. So you start on this first level of play and slowly build up. As opposed to David, who got a 0 for joy. So David was not happy, was demanding and frustrated. You know, he didn't do anything that reflected his own life. And you can see here, he imitated something you did, but he didn't really understand it, and he tended to look at you, and he really had no pleasure, no joy whatsoever. So David needs a lot of work just getting that emotional hook before we build his play. So I'm going to stop sharing because we're going to have a look at the case studies. And so you will need Maxine and Robert. And I'm going to demonstrate the scoring as well as we go. So I'll share my screen. So everyone okay? Got out Maxine, because I'm going to highlight things through that if you wanted to make notes as I go. So let's share my screen, get the right one. So you should be able to see Robert as well as the PowerPoint. So I will go here, and there we are. Here's Robert. So let's read through Robert, and I'll point out the red flags for him, as well as what we can score on this assessment, just to demonstrate what it looks like. Okay, so Robert is a 4-year-old boy who lives at home with his parents and one older and one younger sibling. Okay, he has an older sister of 7 years and a younger brother who's just turned 3. Robert ruins the play scenes and playtime of his older sister. Okay, that's a red flag for, whoa, maybe Robert doesn't understand the play of his sister. Maybe Robert doesn't like his sister, but it is a red flag for, in the back of your head, you're going, okay, if that's happening, I wonder if he doesn't understand the play. So he fights with his younger brother, although at times they can play well if the play is repetitive and sensory. Okay, so the 3-year-old, his 3-year-old brother, he needs to go to those earlier sensory motor levels of play, and then Robert can join him if the play is repetitive and sensory. This tells you Robert might be struggling in pretend play because it's a much more complex play. For example, playing in the sand pit, digging and tipping out sand using a bucket and a spade. Now, I know I haven't been through the development of pretend play, so I'm going to explain where I'm putting things as I go through. So digging and tipping out sand using a bucket and a spade is understanding how you functionally use a bucket and a spade. And on that 12 to 19-month level, that's the first thing that happens before object substitution begins. It's also manipulation of objects, so on that pre-pretend. So it covers that, you know, manipulation and experimenting of objects. But I would also make a note against that's in the sand pit, knowing that's the sand pit, he's using that. So just a bit of background, his mother was concerned about his development since he was 12 months. He was diagnosed at 3 with autism. Children with autism, you really have to look at their play because pretend play is one area they have difficulty with. Sensory modulation was poor, doesn't necessarily impact on pretend play, but something to note in terms of choice of toys maybe. His language was delayed. So language delay is like, yes, we really need to look at his play because they're very strongly linked. Some articulation errors and a poor sense of narrative, that's the big one. that's a big flag. Because if a child has a poor sense of narrative, you know their pretend play is going to be delayed. Okay, so you interviewed his mother and asked her to fill out the parent carer scoring booklet. So she had not seen Robert use objects as something else. Okay, so that means Robert has no object substitution that mum has seen. So that's this level here, just before 2, children start to use objects physically similar. So he's not doing that. Although one day she did see him put a box on his head and look in the mirror. Now, this is where you've really, I'll make that blue, because these are things you've got to look at and really understand what really is going on here. So she did see him one day put a box on his head and look in the mirror. So he can be just putting a box on his head and looking in the mirror because it feels funny. Or is the box on his head a hat? Now, that would be an object substitution, and that would be the beginning of pretend play, but it doesn't really fit in with what we know so far. But if we read a bit more, his mother has seen him dress up, but she said it was more like he was experimenting with clothes and feeling them as he put them on. So I think here, this tells us that, well, you know, putting the hat on his head was just experimenting, just putting it on, and it wasn't really there was no meaning attached to it. So she needs to give him clear instructions and routines at home, otherwise he's in his own world. So that tells you a little bit about his sense of self. So you would put a comment like that. So needs routines. No matter how many times I change this, it still is determined to only type in white. So, so he needs routines. So he can't self-initiate. You know, he needs someone, he can be in his own world. So he fights with his siblings. He's repeated preschool but doesn't seem to be improving. His mother notes that he does not have any friends, okay? And she has seen him take all the yellow trucks out of the sand pit when children were playing with them. So the children had constructed a road system. So this is interesting information because it tells us he is not seeing the play of his peers because he interrupted their big constructed road system where there were trucks for transport with pebbles and leaves, which suggests that when he ruins the play scenes and playtime of his older sister, maybe it is because he does not understand the play because he's doing the same thing with his peers. So he likes yellow and he was bewildered why others were mad at him, and these children don't understand why they're in trouble. Otherwise, he played on his own and did not ask adults for anything needed in play. So these are skills over here in social, and we'll leave them blank because there is no evidence he can do that. So when in block corner, he stacked blocks or knocked other children's constructions down, which again, he's not seeing, you know, that they've actually created something. And she has not seen Robert use character as alive or in role play. So she hasn't seen any doll teddy play or role play. So you looked at him as well, you did a direct observation, and you noted that he tended to play using single repetitive, non-pretend play actions like pushing a truck. Okay, so we've got that experimental stuff here already, but they're not in pretend, it's just moving things around. Or lifting the doll off in peekaboo. So I'm going to make that green because that might be a bit of a hook. So he does play peekaboo. So I will note that because that might be something we can hook him in. His repetitive actions did not occur with other recipients, just himself. So that again is when you get near 19 months, children are using that one action with more than one recipient and he's not. He can't cope with that. He would line up cars. Again, we saw that before, just functional. He also jumped around the room holding his dinosaur, and your observation revealed he would jump with his dinosaur with no meaning, only enjoyment in the movement. Again, this is something where you go, if the dinosaur was jumping and he was jumping with his dinosaur, That's a whole other level of play, because a dinosaur's real and alive and he's playing with his dinosaur that's jumping and he's copying the dinosaur, but that's not happening. He just loves jumping and he just holds his dinosaur when he jumps. So the dinosaur is just an object that he likes to have with him, but the dinosaur's not alive or real. This appeared to be a routine for him when he was overwhelmed or not sure what to do. And this tells us on the enjoyment play scale that that is a 2, which means he has very little spontaneous enjoyment in play. So make that black. He was not interested in your modelled actions of object substitution. So that is confirming Mum has not seen that either. So there's nothing going to happen here. That's as high as we go. Even though Robert was 4 years old, when he did imitate you pushing the truck, he did it flippantly, without meaning, and it was fleeting. So he had no meaning, he just pushed. He did one action, he pushed the truck, he had no meaning. Also, you could say it was an action with an object, which he didn't really understand. He knew the function of pushing, but he didn't know how to drive. You know, when you play with a truck, you push and stop and push and stop. Then he saw a yellow truck near you, picked it up, put it on the ground and watched the wheels turn. He was not curious about your toys and he wanted to go home. So this again is something that we would note in that sense of self. So he's not curious. You know, he just wanted to go home. He did watch with interest when you fed his dinosaur, but he didn't pick up the spoon and feed the dinosaur. So he looked with interest. So that's these little, looking with interest is focused attention. And on this first level of pretend play, that's body. So eating, drinking. He looked at one action, just, you know, one action with you, feeding his dinosaur. He was watching you use the spoon and the cup. So you can say that's the spoon and cup. And he did, that's with the dinosaur. That's one action related to that doll or teddy, in this case, a dinosaur. So he did, you know, he was interested in that. Then he related the spoon to the cup in a flippant action, which we've also noted here. We could put the truck and the spoon and cup with that triangle. He doesn't really know how to play with toys in terms of that pretend play, but it was quite flippant. And overall, his engagement seemed to be a task or routine, and there was no enjoyment. So we know that he's really got low enjoyment in his play. So Robert, even though Robert is 4, the ones I put in red are the red flags that tell you this child does not know how to engage in pretend play. You know, he's not engaging with peers, he's socially isolated, he's destroying other children's play, he needs to be organised, he can't self-initiate himself, and he has no spontaneous pretend play, but he was interested in the dinosaur. So, you know, he does engage in peekaboo, and if you use his dinosaur, you might hook him in. So there's a couple of things there that tell you I might be able to hook this child in to engage him, so I can slowly build this child's ability to engage in pretend play. So we are doing well for time. So we've got a couple of questions. So Boon Wang says, I'm curious if I'm assessing a 10-year-old with additional needs and want to start one-on-one, do I use play scenes for 3 to 5 or those under 3? So if you have a 10-year-old with additional needs, I'm assuming this child is got intellectual, quite a few.
Hi, yeah, he has Down syndrome. Yes.
Yes. I would. What does he do? Can you tell me if he has any concept of what other children are doing, or?
Yeah. He's great into role. Sorry, there's a bit of a lag. It's a bit of a role play when it comes to musical that's about it, because he loves music. But in terms of actually playing, he would have a little dangly thing where he would dangle, and he would have a conversation about it. I see he has some sort of play, but he's not able to manipulate toys,
Okay, yes. I'd start with just those few objects to start with, like the truck and a teddy and a box and a cloth and a spoon and a cup.
Okay.
Because from what you say, I'd start with that first, because he sounds like he's going to be on those very early pre-2 years old level of pretend play.
Yeah, I feel that too myself. Yeah.
Yeah. And if I know a doll's house is quite a complex toy. So, for example, if you gave him a doll's house, he would probably only play with one room. He'd just look at one room and he'd pull everything out, but one room he might be able to play with. And that's what 2-year-olds do. That's how they play with a doll's house. So, but I'd start with just those few toys, because children who have low levels of pretend play get overwhelmed very quickly with too many toys. Yeah.
Thanks, Karen.
Yeah. Good. Yeah, excellent question. Okay, I'll go to Maxine, who's really quite different as a profile for a child, and then hopefully we'll have 5 minutes left for any questions or a bit more. So let's have a look at Maxine. Oops, sorry, I need my screen, not just one of them. So here's Maxine. So let's have a look at Maxine. And again, I'll do a similar thing, look at red flags and also highlight things that we can actually do, score things around her play. So Maxine was a 5-year-old girl who had been referred from a local community early intervention service. So I'm assuming Ireland has similar types of community services. The referral stated that she appeared anxious and had difficulty interacting socially with other children her age. Okay, big red flag for difficulty interacting socially with children her age. Anxious, meaning she's probably not sure what's going to happen. Her preschool teacher had concerns about her ability to cope with primary school, both academically and socially. And I know by the early work in developing the chipper, these children showed significant delays in their ability to organise their actions in play and object substitution. And I now know, 20 years later, they're really critical predictors of narrative. So her speech pathologist found she was delayed 12 months in her receptive and expressive language. So, definitely have a look at her play. Her narrative language was not assessed, which is not unusual, but I would suggest if it was assessed, she would be having difficulty. Her parents were not overly concerned, but they had noticed that she was shy and seemed more anxious than their other two children. They were concerned enough to seek out an assessment. So a nice family. So Maxine would often put her hands over her face when she was feeling overwhelmed socially. So she really gets quite stressed. Maxine did not speak as much as her 4-year-old brother. He was a real chatterbox. So Maxine was the eldest of 3 children, and she had a brother who was 4 and a sister who was 18 months. So just a bit of background on, the parents had an income and they were a very loving family. So you assessed her using the chipper, which showed that she was significantly delayed in both play with toys, the conventional imaginative play, and symbolic play. That means you've really got to use a lot of object substitution with that on the chipper, and she was more than 2 standard deviations below the mean. So I'll just make that orange. That might be hard to see, hang on. Maybe purple. Okay, so that tells me that on the developmental checklist, she's going to be really quite early, an early age in her playability, because that's a significant delay. Children who are more than 2 standard deviations below the mean, mean they're not going to spontaneously develop the ability to play. They really need intervention. So she could not complete the time of the assessment, so she couldn't play for very long. She didn't use templates. By that I mean she didn't copy from movies or books, like she didn't take something she already knew and put it in her play. She did not have clear play scripts. So when you looked at her play, you could not say to yourself, what did she play? And you'd go, I really don't know. She didn't really develop any sort of ideas in her play, and she didn't develop a narrative. So these are all around her quality of play, and just confirm that 2 standard deviations below the mean has implications for the time she plays, for the quality of her play. She didn't talk during the play, which is something you note, but it's not crucial. Some children are quite shy, but she did show decentration in her play. Decentration is that decentering from self, where you impose meaning on something else, like a teddy or a doll. So this was her use of the doll was 19-month level, which means during the chipper assessment, she just used the doll as an object. It didn't talk, it didn't move much. You know, it was just like it was just an object that was there. You also observed her at preschool with peers, and we're going to do the developmental checklist to give us further information on Maxine. So for your total observation time, Maxine stood back and watched her peers before she engaged. All right. And this is well, this is a big red flag for Maxine doesn't know how to play. Maxine can't initiate an idea. Maxine doesn't know how to start play. She doesn't know what to do. So everything we're going to read from now on is not going to be spontaneous, because she watched her peers before she engaged. So we're going to be looking at some sort of imitation if she does anything at all. So she played on her own for most of the observation time. Okay. So socially, that social pretend play is very complex, and we now know, and it's in the new book as well, and I have one of the local therapists here in town has developed group learn to play, and we had a conversation the other day, and we had both come to the conclusion you need to be at least 30 months level in pretend play before you can even begin to play with someone else in terms of a therapy situation. So if she was playing near peers, she was passive and waited for her peers to direct her, or she copied what they were doing. Okay, so she really doesn't know how to start. So for example, she poured tea in a teacup in home corner after her peers made tea for the birthday they were having. All right, so we can score that, but we are going to need a bit more information. She watched others and only then pretended to drink from her cup. All right, so this is imitating on that first level of pretend play, which is around body scripts and one action. But what is it? Is it with meaning or is it without meaning? So she did ask for water in her cup. Okay, that means she cannot use absent objects. Like I have videos of a 12-month-old pretending to have a drink from an empty cup. Okay, and she needs water in the cup. So when children need water in the cup, you know their representational thinking is down, their ability to symbolize and create meaning is way down, and probably no object substitution either. So that tells you quite a bit. But one of her peers said, there's tea in it. It is peppermint. You will love it. And Maxine looked in the cup, looked concerned, and dutifully put the cup to her mouth. Okay, so she's imitating what she sees her peers do, but I'm trying to get across here, she has no idea what the meaning is. Like she's looking concerned, she dutifully does it. So she's imitating, but it's really not with meaning. So, so this is, oh, goodness me, let's go back. So this is one action, putting it to her mouth. Oh, I don't know, hang on. sorry, copy might be useful. So I'll just do a few of those, because we've got a few things we can fill in here. So that's a body script, which is drinking, and she can use the cup, but she's not really using it in pretend that much, like it's in terms of a pretend action with a cup. She's really not sure of what she's doing. Her peers moved to another area of the preschool, however, Maxine remained in home corner. So she put the teddy in the bed and gave Teddy the drink, which she had observed her peers put toys in the bed and at other times fed the toys. Then she took the teddy out of the bed, held it in her hand, looking around. She dropped the teddy on the table and wandered around the room. So she is really, again, Teddy's not real, Teddy's not alive. She's just seen her peers do it, and she's just copying what she saw them do. But, you know, Teddy's just this object, because, you know, she just dropped the teddy and wandered around and didn't do much. So I'm not convinced she really understands the meaning of, you know, Teddy being real and having a drink. So she went to the threading activity, and the teacher guided her in the activity of threading a necklace. She completed it on its own. The teacher put it on her and she wandered outside. So she went to the cubby and watched 3 of her peers playing. And then she went to the sandpit. So she watched 3 of her peers. So playing in the cubby is home things. So you could be generous and go, she had focused attention. This level of play is in the home. So because cubby houses are, you know, playing in the home, and her peers, I'm assuming, this is a big assumption, that they would have been doing more, you know, they would have been doing quite a few actions. You know, they would have been busy. So, but she just watched them. Then she went to the sandpit. So she squatted beside another peer who suggested they make a cake. And she followed physically, I should put in there, she physically followed her peer in spading in the sand, pouring cake and putting it in the box. So she copied physically. And then the peer, that's a nice logical sequence, which would be up here, because at early 2, children have this nice logical sequence of 3 actions. So spading, pouring, putting it in the box. The peer then took the cake out of the oven and commented on how delicious it smelt. And Maxine looked at the peer with surprise and interest, because I'm sure from Maxine's point of view, she was just putting sand in a bucket, and then she was pouring the sand in this other container, and then she put it in a box. So she's very interested and quite surprised that the peer thinks it's cake. So the peer cut the cake and gave some to Maxine. Maxine laughed as she followed her peer in pretending to eat the cake. Her face showed surprise, bewilderment, but enjoyment in being with a peer. So she loves that social interaction, which I'd put in self-representation, but she has no idea really what's going on. So, so up here, you know, she really doesn't understand. So Maxine then left and had a swing, and she stayed on the swing for 15 minutes, and then she went back inside, went back to home corner, picked up Teddy, gave Teddy a drink, so that repeated play, which children on low levels of play often do. And she played independently of 2 other peers who were also in home corner. We've already scored, you know, giving Teddy a drink, so we don't need to do it, but we will note that she went back and did it. She was curious about what the other children played, and she showed moments of pleasure, but these were fleeting. So that gives you a score of 3, but we know that she really does like, she likes to be with peers, but she's bewildered by what they are doing. So, you know, and I'm sure with these children, they are very anxious. They usually are anxious because everything is unpredictable, like they're never sure what's going to happen. We could put, for the following that sequence, we could put another triangle up here, but that gives us more information. And and these are imitation here, so we could have more triangles in role play and in those early levels of role and social. because she is imitating what she's seeing, but she's not really understanding. So Maxine really is, I'll bring that up and reduce it so we can have a look. Maxine, for all intents and purposes, does not have a diagnosis. She's, you know, in a loving family, and she has younger brothers, younger siblings. Maxine, I've met a few Maxines when I was developing the chipper, and children like Maxine challenged my assumption that all children can play, because they can't. She was in this environment that was rich and loving, and she still really needs a lot of help building her playability, because if she goes to school, she's going to fall further and further behind, because she has no pretend play, and because of that she has no sense of narrative or story or socially what's really going on, or seeing the imposed meaning in others. So I'll stop there and open up for questions. So I see we have a couple more. So if a 5-year-old child, possibly ASD, struggles to play, both in class and on the yard, should I, the teacher, be intervening in his play in class or taking him for one-on-one play? Okay, Rebecca, how many other children do you have in your class?
Sorry, wouldn't unmute. A class of like 28.
28?
Yeah.
Wow. And do you have capacity to do some one-on-one with him?
Yeah, I'm the special education teacher.
Oh, great. I would work one-on-one because I've worked with lots of children on the spectrum at that age, and they're usually barely on that first level of pretend play, or if they are, they're just on that first level at all. And they really do need you to sit beside them and model. So the book, the new book, I've got all the theoretical underpinning and the therapeutic skills, but I've also got examples of the types of play activities that are on all those different levels. But I would work with him one-on-one, because children on the spectrum get overwhelmed quite quickly, as you would know, working with him, and they can't tell what's going to happen next, because they're about literally what's happening now. And he's probably quite anxious, I would think.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Does he have any language?
Yeah, he does. He has very good language, but his it's all to the side, if you know what I mean. Like his receptive language isn't great, so he will talk. His vocabulary is very good, but it's not connected to anything that you're actually doing.
Yes. I was going to say, often they have language, but it's not meaningful. It's not actually connected with what they're doing right now. Yeah, no, that's enough for me to. I would be pretty confident he'd be better off one-on-one, and you're probably starting with those very early levels of play. You know, putting Teddy to bed, or giving Teddy a drink, or showing him how to move a truck, playing peekaboo to give him a bit of a break. He will get very tired doing pretend play. Even 20 minutes might be enough as you build it up. But yeah, that's what I would do anyway.
Okay, super. Thank you so much.
Great. Katie says, even more now we are going to see children struggle. Yes. Is that because of the lockdown? Katie, was your comment in relation to that? Because certainly people are saying that here in Australia, because we had 111 days of lockdown in Victoria where the children were homeschooled. You know, they were online learning, and I know there's quite a few children who are repeating school this year. So yes, Paula says, is there a document that you are basing the scores on? Yes, there is, and I'll go back to the PowerPoint. This one. So this is, the manual has all the information I talked about in detail in terms of play development, levels, enjoyment score, as well as that emerging sense of self. The professional scoring booklet has ages in there, and it has a summary of the things that you need on the spot, so that you've got stuff at hand when you're actually scoring. And the parent, I always use the parent carer booklet. I always ask the parents to fill that in. I usually do a chipper because I'm often working with children 5 to 7. So I usually use the chipper, but I always ask the parents to fill that in, because that gives me some valuable information. And it also lets the parents know when I talk about play, what I'm actually talking about, because in there, as they read that through, so in the parent carer booklet, for example, there's a page on play scripts, and starting from the bottom of the page going up, there's a description of how that play skill develops, and parents just identify what they've seen, and then I can transcribe that back into a play level. What are the next steps for Robert and Maxine? Yes, well, that's a whole other webinar. So that's learn to play therapy. So that's looking at where they are, what they're interested in, and how you engage them in play. So the next steps are to engage them emotionally. Maxine doesn't need it so much, but Robert needs that a lot, because that emotional engagement, we know in the neurobiology of play, is really critical. And you're starting to get them to do one action with one object, to understand that the teddy is going to sleep, to understand that teddy's having a drink, for example, to understand, we put things in the truck and push it round to somewhere else. And then you slowly build that with teddy becoming alive and real. And there's a whole lot of levels in play that you work from there. And I expect to see changes in Robert and Maxine in terms of their language and in terms of their social awareness by about 8 sessions of Learn to Play. I expect to see a change starting to happen. And then after that, it gets a bit quicker. Yes, definitely seeing children with lockdown. That's from Katie. One little girl was completely withdrawn. Yes, that's happening here as well. So there are, I absolutely agree with you. So Sinead said, I'm wondering why a child's play skills can be limited in ways described. Well, yeah, that's a good question. I've asked myself a lot. Sometimes it's environmental, particularly if you have neglect, it's really obvious. Or, the family doesn't really go out or go on excursions, or really there's very little happening. Sometimes there's no reason at all. Sometimes it's neurological, like a child on the spectrum, or a child with Down syndrome, for example, that their development is impacted. And sometimes, like Maxine, there's no reason. So it's a myth that all children develop play, because not all of them do. And those who don't need help and support. So Katia says there are 6 children with moderate to mild disabilities. What's an SNA? I'm not familiar with that one. Non-verbal display, yes.
Assistant.
Sorry?
Sorry.
Special
It's a classroom assistant.
Oh, great. Excellent. You certainly will need them. Yes, I'm sure your children are non-verbal and display most red flags, yes, because they'll have no pretend play. We do have, one of my doctoral students did her PhD looking at Learn to Play in special schools, where that describes the children that we were looking at. And her second paper's just been published with interviews with teachers about the changes they saw in the children after 1 year of having Learn to Play in the schools. So we do a lot of pre-pretend with those children going to those first and second levels of play. And you need a year to, over a year, the teachers were starting to see changes in their talking, less fighting in the playground, less arguments, and calmer. So again, how could you support and enhance their ability? So Learn to Play is one way to do that, because it's about understanding where children's play is, knowing where you start and knowing where you go next. And the new book has a whole It's got engagement activities, pre-pretend activities, and then it's got activities for each of those skills. I know we're up to time. Just one more question. If a child with autism diagnosis has age-appropriate pretend play skills and a history of age-appropriate pretend play, would that make, yes, that would really make me wonder if the diagnosis is accurate. Absolutely. And then you wonder about, is it attachment? Is it some sort of early trauma? Is it anxiety? Yes, I've been working a long time now, and I've never come across a child with a diagnosis of autism and age-appropriate pretend play in a play assessment. I've worked with a lot of very high functioning children on the spectrum who do incredibly well, but yes, can you share the link? Yes, I can. I'll see if I can put that in the chat box. Now I also sent it to Eileen, so here we go. So that's the link. It's just come out. It's barely been out 4 weeks. Has a USB in the back with 114 play handouts and a play background checklist. So
Karen, you might put up the link for the enjoyment pack as well, the assessment.
Oh yeah, okay. I'll get that for you. I'll just put the starter pack up. Goodness, Jessica's got all. Here we go. Got that one. While I remember, the Chipper assessment is going to be online training permanently. It's going to be 10 hours of self-study or something like that. And then we'll do 10 hours of small group, like 5 in a group, just analysing children's play assessment. That's not ready yet. I'm still working on it, but that will be, I'm just saying this year it will be up and ready. Yes, we do deliver to Ireland. It's my daughter's company that does all this because I couldn't keep up with it. So she is finishing her other job next week, and she's going to go full time with Learn to Play with her company. And one thing I'm going to say to her is if she can find a European distributor, because we've tried a couple of places, but no one emails back. So if we can find someone overseas that she can send a whole lot over, and they can sell. Yes, but we do. She posts anywhere in the world as long as, in terms of COVID, we can post stuff. So from Australia, we can send things to Ireland. We can't send anything to Brazil at the moment, but yeah, okay. So thank you. I am over time.
I just see somebody saying about Book Depository doesn't have your book available at the moment, but it's available from your own website.
Yeah, that's the only place it's available.
Karen, thank you. Oh, I'll turn off my thing. Thank you so much. That was fabulous. I don't know how you managed to put all that in that length of time. So hats off, kudos, well done. And you made it also easy to follow and interesting, and people do have the handout, and it's just been great. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I hope I haven't overwhelmed you, which is,
no,
thank you so much.
No, we know that in an hour and a half, you're teaching exactly what you did. What are the red flags? That was it, and giving people a really strong understanding of when we should be concerned. And it's not possible to do more than that in the time. But you actually did manage to do more than that. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Eileen. Thank you, everyone, for listening.
Join us.
Yeah.
And well done for such a wonderful presentation, Karen. And we shall leave it there. We'll let everybody head out, and I'll be in touch by email with you, Karen.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Thank you.